Good morning, everyone. My name is Mattéo Delabre, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing with our team, Nadia and Johan, on reconstructing the evolutionary history of gene synthenies. So what we refer to as gene synthenies are basically any kind of gene clusters that are known to have a shared evolution using shared evolution by segmental events. So, for example, caste systems or parents. And by segmental events, I mean, for example, segmental duplications. In the simple example here, we have genes A, B, C, D, which are duplicated together in a new synteny BCD. The thing is that, as with individual genes, gene synthenies co-evolve with their species. And so we're able to apply similar techniques as we use for gene families to gene synthenies. So as you may know, the fact that genes and species co-evolve creates inconsistencies when you look at the phylogenies of both the gene families and the species. And both phylogenies can be reconciled using reconciliation, which basically postulates ancestral events such as duplications and horizontal transfers to explain why there are inconsistencies in the phylogenies. And using these events, we can postulate scenarios for the evolution. Well, now, what we call super-reconciliation is just an extension of this concept to synthenies. So instead of having duplications of single genes, we consider segmental events to describe the history of synthenies. So this is just a toy example of genes and species. Here we have gene phylogeny at the top, which belongs to the set of species below, as indicated by the dashed lines. And you can see that both are inconsistent. For synthenies, it's a very similar setup, but instead of just single genes, we get a tree of synthenies. This is illustrated by the fact that at the bottom we have labels, which are strings of genes. So, for example, the first one would indicate that there are both genes A, B, and E present in the syntheny. The next one is genes A and F. And you see that in this syntheny tree are contained many gene trees. There is the gene tree for family A, for family B, etc. So this is kind of the input, the setup for syntheny reconciliation. And now we designed an extended model of evolution for taking into account the evolution of synthenies. So first we make a simplifying assumption by modeling synthenies as sets instead of strings, which makes the problem a little bit more tractable. But this has the downside, two main downsides actually. The first downside is that we discard gene orders, of course, and the second one is that we discard multiplicities. If there are multiple instances of a gene family in a syntheny, we will not see that in the sets. So having said that, we specify 7 types of events, which are in 2 main categories. There are divergence events, which create new copies of synthenies. The most basic one being speciations, where the syntheny simply follows the speciation of its host. This is illustrated at the top left drawing. This keeps the same content of the syntheny as there was in the ancestor. The contents are just illustrated with those little shapes here. Yeah, that's it. we just follow the host. In duplication and cuts, which are the next two events, we stay in the same host, but we extract a part of an existing synteny and either create a new copy or simply move it to a new synteny. So if we create a copy, this is a duplication, and if we move it to a new synteny, it's a cut. And both of those events have their transfer counterparts. So duplication with transfer and cut with transfer, where in addition to creating new copies, we also move them to a separate but coexisting host. So these are the divergence events, and synthenies can also evolve on their own by gains and losses of contents. So we can either add new genes or remove genes during the evolution of the synteny. So this is kind of the model we're using here. It's making a lot actually of simplifying assumptions, but this is helpful to make the underlying algorithmic problem tractable, as I mentioned. So using these events, we can build trees of events, which we call the scenarios. And we're looking for, of course, specific kinds of scenarios which explain the initial phylogenies that we got as input. So specifically, we're looking for scenarios such that the leaves at the end are the same as the synteny leaves that we got at the start. And the topology has to match also. Otherwise, it's not really explaining what we had at the start. And the events along this tree have to happen along the specified species tree. But we also allow, as was also done for individual gene families, we also allow for unsampled or extinct lineages to be postulated by the scenario. And this is especially important when we consider transfers, as we may have an incomplete sampling of the species, or we may even have extinct species which we can't sample by definition. But those species can still take part in the evolution through transfers. So we also allow for that. So let's get back for a moment to the example I mentioned at the start. And here's a possible scenario to explain the phylogenies. So I'll try to show using my hand. It's not easy, but so this is sideways, as you can see, and the leaves at the right part of the tree do match the leaves of the initial synteny tree. And there are some additional leaves, for example, the leaf at the or the crosses at the bottom left, which are additional leaves actually, but we allow for that because there are see them in the final phylogeny, and this is normal because these are lost leaves. So when I said that the leaves must match, it was a bit of a simplification. The visible leaves must match. So for the rest of the scenario, we start with a speciation at the left of the scenario in species delta. So it's not at the root of the species, it's at the left species. And we start actually using an unsampled species. So to reach the species number 1, starting from delta, instead of using losses, we use a unsampled species, which is called delta star, and then transfer back to species number 1. Another interesting part is the cut event. It's the one below the initial speciation, where the ADE synteny is cut into 2 parts, the AD part and the E part. Right, that's the main highlights I wanted to give on this scenario. So this is kind of one of the possible scenarios to explain this input. But of course, we want to have a rigorous definition for which scenarios are best explanations. And we take the usual approach of maximum parsimony. So we give each event type a fixed cost, which we can interpret more or less as an inverse probability. And we seek actually least costly scenarios. So the scenarios for which the sum of the cost of the events is the least. And for example, the scenario that I just gave you is optimal. It was one of the optimal solutions if the losses cost 1, duplications and cuts cost 2, and transfer cost 3. The problem is that the space of possible scenarios is actually unbounded in size, because we can always transfer back and forth between species and create even larger and larger scenarios. And even if we restrict to only optimal scenarios, well, the size of that can be exponential. But this space of scenarios has some structure to it, which is kind of similar to usual reconciliations. The first thing to notice is that the scenarios has to pass through all the divergences of the initial synteny tree. This is because it has to match the topology. So these act like some kind of waypoints through which the scenario has to pass. And around those waypoints or more like between those waypoints are event paths that are needed to connect together those divergences. So more specifically, we can decompose any scenario into sub-scenarios that start at the next divergence and link together with event path. So if we start with a divergence that is linked to species S and has contents X, and we want to reach, well, we can reach the sub-scenario at species U and with contents Z, but only if we have some sequence of events that explains how we get from point A to point B, so to say. And for usual reconciliation, as we'll see, this is an easy task, but using the extended model makes it a little bit more complicated. So the third item here is just a more formal statement of what we mean by event path. So specifically, we have to start from the SX state and somehow reach the target state, but we don't want to introduce new visible leaves so as to respect the condition that I mentioned at the start, which is to have matching visible leaves. And so what are those possible event paths? Well, there are many. The one on the left is the usual one that we take with usual reconciliations. It is just to postulate speciations, as many as we need to reach the target species from the initial species and add losses on the way. But using the other types of events, we can complete this path in other ways. For example, we can completely cut the synteny from species S to species T using a transfer, a cutting transfer. This is also valid because since the cut is complete, well, there are no remaining parts after we've done the cut in the initial branch, and all the synteny has been transferred to the new species. So we have no extra visible leaf. Of course, this is only possible if species S and T are separate, because we cannot have a transfer from a parent to a child. They have to be coexisting. But another way to do it, if they are not separate, is to use unsampled species to get from our start to our destination. So we start by postulating an unsampled species from which we will be able to make the transfer. And here, this is not a cutting transfer because it doesn't matter what remains below this branch, since this is a loss for extinct species anyways. So these are like the three main kinds of possible event path, and we have to take the three of them into account when we are computing reconciliations. So now that we have this recursive structure, we can get dynamic programming formulation. which is really similar to the dynamic programming formulations for usual reconciliations. And we have an extra parameter called x, which is the contents of the synteny at a given point. So the recurrence equation uses the C function, which gives the value of the best scenario that starts at the synteny node V associated to S with contents X. And we are able to compute this function recursively by just trying all possible event types at each node and using the decomposition that I mentioned earlier. And this is just an example of one of the recursion function if we want to compute the cost of speciation at a given node. And there are some extra details for handling gains and losses, which I can go into further details later. The great point about having a dynamic programming formulation is that we can reuse most of the work that has been done on these kinds of recurrences. Of course, we can compute the least cost of a scenario, but is not very interesting. We can also enumerate the most parsimonious solutions or count how many exist. And then there are more advanced applications, which I just mentioned 3 of them here. We can uniformly sample optimal solutions. In case we don't have values for the costs of the events, we can just enumerate solutions which are called Pareto optimal. These are the solutions for which the counts of the events are not well, they cannot be better than that they are. And we can also create equivalence classes of solutions and enumerate them. So to finish, I just mentioned that this is still ongoing work. There is a preliminary implementation of the algorithm available at the mentioned link, and we're performing evaluations on simulated and real data. And we're looking to further extensions of this work. Well, the first point I mentioned here as an open question is how to build the synteny trees, which has been an outstanding question for a while and still unsolved. The second point is that once we have considered cut events, as I mentioned, it's very tempting to consider fusion events, which are kind of the counterparts that would bring together 2 existing synthenies. But this will lead to networks, and we would have to consider a model of reconciliation of synteny network with a species tree. Well, there has been some work on that for individual gene families, and we know that this is a tractable problem for 3-child networks. But it's still we have to see if this can be extended to our framework. And as a final food for thought, I'll just mention that it would be interesting to kind of try to minimize the number of unsampled species that we use, because otherwise we can kind of cheat by using a lot of unsampled species to do a lot of transfers. And as far as I know, this is not something that has been addressed before. So this is kind of the work. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Okay, we have time for one question. Do we have a question from Gino? Shout out your question, please, and then Mattéo, would you please repeat it?
I'll try my best. Okay. Is there some kind of interpretation for the cost of each operation, like, for example, an evolutional risk of performing this task, or is there some intuition that you have that you could encode there?
Thank you for the question. So the question is, if I understand correctly, what kind of interpretation we can give to event costs. So, well, event costs, as I mentioned in the presentation, can be seen as inverse probabilities. So this is just a different way of stating it. So we would put a bigger cost on events that are least probable. But we have to estimate these probabilities in some kind of way, right? So this is another separate problems actually, to kind of estimate what are the probabilities of the events. And this would depend on the specific application. For example, in different species, we could have different probabilities for having transfers versus having duplication, etc.
Thank you.
Thanks.